Hi Seagull class. The next Read-Aloud adventure we're going on is our book from the classroom, Illustrated Fables from Around the World. And the stories in this book don't have just one author, but many authors. So let me read you this first part about the stories. Long ago, everything from the changing of the seasons to the passage of the sun to the sky was an unsolved mystery. So people came up with stories to explain how things came to be. These stories, known as myths or fables, vary from place to place, but all had a shared thread running through them. They set out to explain the inexplicable, to offer a version of the world that made sense. The stories in this book are hundreds or thousands of years old. They were first being told long before the advent of science, when people still commonly believed in giants and spirits and mythical beings that could change from one form to another in the blink of an eye. Between these pages, you'll meet a spider who can outwit a god, a frog who drains the world of water, fierce goddesses, trickster gods, and a doll who unleashes the winds. After so much time and so many tellings, these stories may no longer be quite the same tales or have quite the same meanings as when they were first told. But that doesn't make them any less exciting. Read on to discover 18 wonderful myths and fables from around the world. And one of the reasons why these stories change so much is because this was before writing was invented. So, these stories could only be told orally. Oral means through the mouth. These stories were only told orally for a long, long time. And one day writing was invented. And as people learned about writing, they wrote these stories down. But by then, so many different stories had changed and become new stories. And even after writing was invented, it was a long time before printing existed. And so books had to be written by hand. And that's a lot of work, and sometimes the person who was writing down the story might change it a little bit. But let's get started on the very first story, Demeter and Persephone. In ancient Greece, Demeter was worshipped as goddess of the harvest and agriculture. This story of her love and loss explains how the seasons came to be. Here's an illustration of Demeter and Persephone. Oh, and we do know the illustrator of this book is Anya Klaus. At the beginning of the world, there were no seasons. All year round, the rain fell and the sun shone, and crops grew and fruit dropped ripe and luscious from the trees. Flowers blossomed in the meadows, and the new shoots sprang from the fertile soil. Tending them all was Demeter, goddess of the harvest. And at her side, as fair as the wild flowers, was her daughter, Persephone, beloved by all and adored by her mother. But another god had his eye on her. Hades, lord of the underworld, had spied Persephone and wanted her for himself. he went to Zeus, king of the gods, to seek permission. And to his delight, Zeus agreed to his plan. As long as he could snatch her away, Persephone would be his. Hades watched and he waited until Persephone was out alone one day in a field of golden corn. As she walked among their shining stems, she felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. With a great crack, the earth opened before her, revealing a dark chasm. And out of it, on a horse-drawn chariot of black and gold, swept Hades. He plucked Persephone from the field as easily as if she were a flower herself, and then swept her down, down, down into the underworld. The chasm closed over their heads, and all was quiet. All was dark. When Demeter discovered that her daughter was missing, she was inconsolable. She began to search the world for her, neglecting the earth she so loved. Flowers died, crops withered, fruit failed to ripen, and the soil turned to chalky dust. People and animals starved, but Demeter didn't notice. At last, Helios, the sun god, took pity on her. "Demeter," he said, "I saw on my travels what happened. Hades, god of the underworld, has snatched your daughter away." "So she's in the land of the dead," wailed Demeter. "How has Zeus let this happen?" "Zeus knew all along," confessed Helios. In a fury, Demeter stormed Zeus's palace on Mount Olympus. "How could you let my daughter be taken from me?" she raged. Zeus looked down at the withered earth, the starving people and dying plants, and admitted something had to be done. So he called for Hermes, the winged messenger, and sent him down to the underworld. "Bring back Persephone," he commanded, "or all is lost." So down in the darkness of the underworld, Persephone missed the sunlight and the warmth and the flowers of the world above, but most of all, she missed her mother. Hades, however, treated her with kindliness and gentleness. She was intrigued by the dark caverns of this new realm, its glittering gemstones, and the piteous plight of the souls of the dead. Could she, after all, become the queen of the underworld? Hades sat beside her day after day, urging her to be happy and tempting her to eat. "Just a few tiny mouthfuls," he coaxed, tipping some pomegranate seeds into the palm of her hand. "Come, Persephone, taste them. They're like glinting jewels." Here's another illustration of Hades trying to feed Persephone these pomegranate seeds. Do you see what they're wearing? Special clothing that people wore back when the story was invented. And look at this beautiful border that goes around. Tentatively, Persephone looked down at the juicy red seeds. Then she popped 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 into her mouth. Hades watched her eat each one with glowing satisfaction. Then came a rushing of wind, like the sound of birds in flight, and the messenger Hermes stood before them. "Ah, a visitor," said Hades. "I've been expecting you." "I come from Zeus," replied Hermes. "Hades, you must let Persephone return. The king of the gods demands it." "Of course I obey Zeus in all things," said Hades, "but in this I can't." And he held up his hands in mock sorrow. "There is a law, is there not, that it is only possible to leave the underworld if no food has passed your lips?" "That is so," said Hermes. Persephone gasped. "Yes, my love," said Hades. "You have just eaten 6 seeds." Hermes paused. There was a deal to be done here, and he loved nothing more than a deal. If he returned without Persephone, Zeus would never forgive him, and the earth would suffer. But nor could he break the law of the fates that the fates had made at the dawn of time. 6 seeds shall equal 6 months, said Hermes. For 6 months of the year, Persephone shall live down here in the darkness, with Hades, as queen of the underworld. And for the other 6 she may return to earth, and tend to the flowers and the fruit and the soil with her mother. Persephone smiled. It is a fair plan, she said. And so for 6 months of the year, when Persephone reigned in darkness, Demeter wept. The leaves fell from the trees, and the land was whipped by cold wind, and her tears fell as rain. Then, in the spring, when Persephone returned, the earth burst into life with Demeter's joy. New shoots appeared, flowers blossomed, and crops ripened under the golden sun. And so it went, year after year, cycle after cycle. And this is how the seasons came to be. What did you think of that story? That was the story that they told when people asked why were there seasons. And now we know that there's a different reason, and maybe you can find out, or maybe you already know from lessons that you've had. But it is a good story, isn't it? It's very interesting. I wonder if you want to write a skit about that story. This next one is called The Greedy Frog. Aboriginal Australians often tell myths of the dream time, a time of creation inhabited by ancestral spirits, such as the mischievous frog in this tale. Here's a little picture, a little illustration of the mischievous frog. Although to me it looks like he's sleeping, but maybe he's only pretending. The Greedy Frog. Tidalik, the frog, was fast asleep. He had been sleeping for years, curled up in a ball underground. None of the other animals knew where he was, or even if he was still alive. It was only when a powerful storm arrived, filling the sky with booming thunder and pelting the ground with stinging rain, that Tiddalik finally woke up. And slowly, very slowly, he opened one eye. Then, just as slowly, he opened the other. With a grunt and a sigh, he began to dig his way to the surface. "At last," he gasped, when his head popped out of the soggy soil. With one final kick of his back legs, he hopped right out of the ground, landing with a splat in front of a rather shocked platypus. Who are you?" the platypus stammered, unsure of what to make of this sudden, surprising creature. Tiddalik yawned. "Who am I? What are you talking about? It's me, Tiddalik. Don't you recognize me?" "Tiddalik," replied the platypus, squinting as he tried to identify the frog under all the mud. "Where have you been hiding all of these years?" For a second, the frog looked confused. "Has it really been years?" he murmured. He shook his head. "There was a terrible drought, so I decided to burrow underground and take a little nap until the water returned. I suppose I must have overslept." The platypus was incredulous. "You were asleep this whole time? No wonder I didn't recognize you. And you're so thin. Come, follow me. There's a lake nearby. You must be really thirsty." Tiddalik followed the platypus to an enormous lake, bustling with all kinds of animals. Ducks and geese swam across its surface. Herons waded in the shallows, hunting water spiders. Even a crocodile was sprawled out on a far bank, basking in the sun after the storm. The moment Tiddalik saw the shimmering water, his eyes lit up. He had been dreaming about water for years, but he had forgotten how beautiful it could be. He raced to the edge of the lake and took a few delicious sips. The platypus smiled. "I knew you were thirsty," he said smugly. But he didn't know just how thirsty. What started off as a few small sips quickly became massive gulps. "More," Tiddalik gurgled, unable to satisfy his thirst. He swallowed more and more water, growing larger and larger while the bank began to shrink. "Stop, that's enough," cried the platypus, watching in horror as Tiddalik gulped down the lake. But instead of stopping, the frog opened his mouth even wider. Glug! The herons found themselves plodding through the mud. Glug! The ducks and geese had to fly away to avoid being swallowed. Glug! Fish of all shapes and sizes were suddenly flapping about on dry land. And when at last the lake was completely drained dry, Tiddalik was so big and bloated that he could barely breathe. The other animals looked at him with a mixture of fear and anger. Only the crocodile, seemingly unconcerned by the frog's greed, continued to laze in the sun. "Look at what you did," yelled the platypus. "Give us back our water." But Tiddalik was not done. "So thirsty," he croaked, looking around for more. In the distance he spotted a long, winding river, sparkling as it snaked across the plain. Without a moment's hesitation, he set off for it, bouncing and rolling all the way. The animals chased after him, shouting as they went. When Tiddalik reached the river, he opened his mouth wider than ever before and began slurping up the water from the river. This time, his gulps were so powerful that they sucked in the water from all across the land. With each mouthful, a lake shrank or a stream dwindled until they were devoured all together by the thirsty frog. And when he was done, not even a puddle remained. Tiddalik was now bigger than a hill, and still he wasn't happy. "I want more," he said. "There is no more," the platypus called from below. "You've taken it all, and it's time you gave it back." Tiddalik scoffed. "Why should I? If you wanted this water so badly, maybe you should have drunk it first. But you didn't. Now leave me alone." The frog let out a massive yawn. "I want another nap." "Oh, no, you don't," the platypus shouted. "You give us back our water right now, or else." On hearing the platypus's threat, Tiddalik began to smile. Compared to Tiddalik, the platypus was tiny. What could a tiny platypus do to a giant frog? The thought was enough to make him laugh. But the moment he did, his belly tightened, causing a fountain of water to erupt from his mouth. At once, the frog clamped his mouth shut, refusing to let out any more. "Aha," said the platypus, watching water trickle down the frog's chin onto his swollen belly. "Now I know just how to get our water back." So he turned to the others and began whispering his plan. When he was done, the spiny echidna took a step forward. "Give us back our water, you greedy frog," she squeaked. But the frog just snorted and rolled his eyes. "So be it," she said, and rolled up into a ball. Tiddalik smirked. "You won't be able to pop me with your sharp spines," he said matter-of-factly. But instead, the echidna rolled onto her back and then unfolded into the most bizarre pose. Her long tongue was lolling out of her mouth. Her legs were stretched wide in all directions, and she was singing a song in the silliest voice. At first, the frog thought that the echidna was crazy. Then he spotted an owl, twirling around and around on his feet until he was so dizzy that he fell over. Alongside him was a koala, juggling mice so badly that most of the time they landed on her face and had to run down her shoulders and along her arms, back into her hands in order to be juggled again. The frog suppressed a giggle. It was all so ridiculous. Tiddalik watched as the platypus started quacking like a duck, and a duck started growling like a tiger. Even the lazy crocodile was dancing upright on his back legs. The frog felt his stomach groan and clamped his mouth tight shut. Beads of sweat were running down his face as he struggled not to laugh. Then came the eel. She stood up on her tail and began waggling to and fro, tying herself in a series of knots. And by mistake, she wove herself into such a tight knot that she couldn't get out of it again. She wriggled around on the floor, calling for help, and that was far more than Tiddalik could cope with. His belly let out a great grumbling sound, louder than thunder, and a torrent of water exploded from his mouth. He roared with laughter, hard enough that he thought he might split into two, spewing out more and more water with each guffaw. At first, the animals cheered, but their joy turned into panic when the water started rising around them. "What do we do?" the echidna cried. The platypus hadn't thought that far ahead. He had just assumed that all of the water would go back to where it had come from. But instead, it was pouring out of the frog in every direction, making new rivers wherever it fell. "There's only one thing we can do," shouted the platypus. "Run away!" As quickly as they could, the animals ran, flew, hopped, and slithered away in search of dry land, until only Tiddalik was left. With an ear-popping burp, a final stream gushed from the frog's mouth, along with a rather confused catfish. "Well, that was rather unpleasant," said the fish before swimming away. "Yes," agreed Tiddalik, small again, and even thinner than before. He felt sick to his stomach, and more than a little sorry for himself. "I don't think I'll be doing that again." I wonder what that story was meant to explain. What question people had that story answered for them. Maybe something to do with a drought, because all of the water went away, but then it came back, so maybe a drought and then a monsoon? Or maybe something to do with rivers being in different places? I don't know. Maybe you can think of an interesting story about a rainy season and a dry season. What are the rainy seasons for us in South Florida? And what is our dry season? Do we even have a dry season? I wonder what the most rainfall South Florida has ever gotten. I wonder when that was. Maybe you can find out and let me know. What things are you curious about? Maybe you can make up a story that answers something that you're curious about. And it doesn't have to be real, and it doesn't have to really answer the question according to science, but it could just be a funny little myth like one of these. I'll have more myths for you later.